Hi everybody. Welcome back to Newton Community Farms YouTube channel. My name's Hope, if I haven't met you before, and on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock we talk about farming and gardening. So if you're tuning in today, odds are you might be interested in farming or gardening, or both, and today we'll be talking about root vegetables and some tips for growing them and some things to keep in mind along the way. So for those of you who may have purchased seedlings at our seedling sale over the last few weeks, I hope that they're going well. I've planted a few here. So I'm actually at Newton Community Farm. I'm doing a little bit of work with the farm ops team right now, and it's very exciting to see how that side of Newton Community Farm works. And some of the seedlings from the seedling sale are now in the learning garden here that we use for educational programs when we're able to. And it's very exciting to see things grow. So hopefully you're having a similar kind of experience with your crops. And we're always excited to hear about what's growing. So reach out with any questions or exciting developments in your garden. Because this is live, if you're watching live with us, you have the opportunity to use the chat box, which is somewhere on the screen. I'm never quite sure, on some side of me or below me or above me. And I love getting questions and I love interacting with folks who are watching. So if you have any comments, anything to add to what I talk about today or any questions along the way, feel free to drop them in there. And I'll do my best to answer them if I have any sort of an answer. So like I said, today we're going to talk a bit about growing root vegetables and some things to keep in mind, and some tips and tricks of growing root vegetables. So to clarify that language, root vegetables are any crop that are grown specifically for its root. So any crop that is under the soil that we want. So I'm talking about things like potatoes, yams, beets, carrots, turnips, radishes, parsnips. Did I say that one already? Parsnips, and onion and garlic. So root vegetables are the things that are grown specifically for their roots. So what we're trying to get out of it is the root. Some of these have edible greens as well. So when we're talking about something like beets, those greens are edible. So you're getting not only the root, but the byproduct is the greens, which are pretty delicious. If you've never tried cooking your beet greens, it's a lovely way to use the entire crop. The fun thing I think about growing root vegetables is that it's kind of an act of faith. So we don't really know what's going on beneath the soil. But we do know that something's growing, and what we can see above the soil can give us some clues about how everything's going underneath the soil. But for the most part, we just have to trust and believe that whatever's going on where we can't see it is going to turn into a crop that we eventually want. So hopefully some of the tips that we talk about today will be beneficial for you moving forward with growing your root vegetables. So I'd say that the first tip for growing root vegetables is having loose soil. So loose soil doesn't necessarily have to be soil that you can stick your hand in and move the soil around, but it shouldn't be super compacted. So something that can be worked, and we're thinking about loose soil because the soil needs to be loose enough for these crops to set roots down there. And if it's super compacted or very rocky, you can end up with some kind of distorted roots or forked roots. So when you have carrots in rocky soil, they can split off like a fork and end up with like kind of two carrots in one, which is still edible and fine. But I know a lot of gardeners are looking for, really hardy, pretty root vegetables, especially when it comes to carrots. So thinking about loose soil is a really good first step. A way to loosen the soil is, if you're not mechanized, which many of us aren't, you can always use a broad fork or some kind of a pitchfork or even a shovel just to kind of break up the soil. The deeper you can go, depending on how compacted your garden space is, the better. If it's a bed that if it's a garden bed that you've used in a previous season, it should be fine to just loosen up the soil more so on the top in the beginning of the season before planting, something like carrots or beets. But if you've never cultivated the land before, you will need to kind of get down in there and loosen up as much of the soil as deep as you can. A good part besides root systems about a benefit of having loose soil, I would say, is also adequate drainage. So when we water our plants, we want the water to be absorbed into the soil. So rather than running off of the top of the soil and kind of ending up going into the lawn or whatever areas surrounding our garden, we want the soil to absorb the water so that the water goes down into the soil. So having really compacted, like crusted over soil will make it harder for the water to, first off, for the soil to retain any water. And then if it does retain some water, it'll make it harder for the water to be drained out. And that's tough with root vegetables because water retention typically leads to rot in these kinds of crops. So we should be seeing the soil like kind of drying out between waterings, not to the point that it's crusty and compacted, but enough that it's not holding on to too much water and causing the crops under the soil to rot. And like I mentioned in the beginning, the leaves on the top of the soil, most of these crops that we're talking about, these root crops, they send out quite a bit of leafy growth, and those leaves are really good. They hold really good clues for figuring out what's going on beneath the soil. So, for example, if the leaves are droopy and pale, you might not be giving them enough water, or you might have a clue there about drainage. If the edges of the leaves are kind of singed and flaky, that can be something to address as well. So we're looking for really healthy, vibrant green top growth, and that usually signals to us that things are going pretty well beneath ground in terms of water and nutrients. Maybe not always so much rocks or not distorted roots, but it's a really good start to make sure that we're getting enough water and nutrients to everything beneath the ground. So keeping an eye on what's above the soil is a really great way to start off with that. So that's tip number one. If we're going to break it into sections, which I will for the sake of doing it, we've just talked about loose soil. So the second tip, I want to add one more thing about loose soil, is that, and I'll touch upon this when we talk about a couple of crops specifically and crop needs specifically, but with root vegetables, some of them will do okay in a raised bed with some like fluffy soil that doesn't have many rocks or old roots in it. So we'll talk about beets a little bit later in this episode, and beets don't tend to root as deep as other root crops, so they can be pretty good candidates for being grown in a raised bed where we have a lot more control over how compacted or how loose the soil is. So we'll talk about that a bit more, because I know a lot of us home gardeners have raised beds. I know I have one at home. It's not very deep, so I'm not growing any root vegetables in it, but if you have the luxury of having a nice deep raised bed at home, you can definitely be thinking about what kind of root crops can go in there. So the second tip for growing root crops is space and time. So different root crops are going to have different requirements. So something like radish is a really quick growing root crop, and it won't take up a lot of space, and they don't get huge, they don't get very bushy on the top growth area, but something like potatoes tend to be these really big green top growth plants, and they take up a lot of space, and they take up space for a long time. So with growing root crops, we want to think about how much space will they take up and how long will they be in the soil. And that can help us to really navigate our garden planning better. So if there's an area of our garden that we want to plant and kind of not think about for a little while, a longer season root crop like potatoes or yams might be a good candidate for that area. But if there's a bed that, we maybe want to plant cucumbers in the beginning of July, but we want to use it now in the beginning of June because that's a whole month of growing. So we could use a quick growing root crop like radish or even turnips or even beets, really, to get the most out of that space before we plant something later in the season. So keeping in mind space and time. And like I said, with the potatoes and radish example, sometimes, well, all the time, we want to be thinking about which root crops take up the most amount of space. So before we plant potatoes, we want to make sure we know how much room they're going to need to grow so that we can properly space them out. So with planting our root crops, some are going to be direct seed, which means that we'll put the seeds directly in the soil, cover them up, pat them down, water them, and let them germinate right in the bed where they'll be growing. Or they'll be transplant, which means that they can be seeded in a seed tray or in a small pot on your windowsill and then moved into the bed or the raised bed or the area in your garden where they'll be growing for their lifespan. So we want to be thinking about whether or not these crops will be direct seed or transplant. And if they're direct seed with a lot of root crop vegetables, we're going to be needing to thin them. So if we're sprinkling carrots into the raised bed or into the soil in your garden, you'll want to go through and thin them. So carrot seeds tend to be pretty small, and it's hard to kind of evenly space them in the garden. So once they're an inch or two tall, we want to go through and thin them so they have a few inches between them so that they have plenty of room to grow their roots nice and big, which is what we want when we're growing carrots. A note on space is to not be tempted to squeeze in more than we realistically have room for. So something like carrots, you can squeeze a lot into a small amount of space, but keep in mind that the closer together the seedlings are, the more they'll be competing for room underneath the soil. So carrots can be a little bit deceptive because their tops, their tops do tend to indicate the size, but sometimes the carrots can be plumper and wider than the tops of the carrots. And if you've grown carrots before, you know that the tops tend to be tall and frilly and kind of fern-like. And they can give us a hint to how much space the carrots have underground, but not necessarily all the time. So it's good to check the back of your seed packet and see how much space whatever variety of carrots you have need to grow. And yeah, the same applies for a raised bed. So if you're planting your carrots or your beets in a raised bed, just knowing how much space they each need between them is going to be a really good place to start. So that's tip number 2, space and time. And tip number 3 is sunlight. So as we've been talking about, root vegetables are growing under the ground. So it can be a little bit counterintuitive to think that these crops need a lot of sun, but most root crops do need full sun to be as happy and healthy and productive as they can be. So despite the fact that what we want is growing under the ground, so for example, if we're growing potatoes, they're all underground, we can't see them, but there's a lot of top growth that's going to need all that light to photosynthesize and continue sending nutrients down underneath the soil and making sure that all of these crops are getting their sugars and nutrients. And they need those leafy greens before the roots under the ground really start to plump up and get sweet and elongate and do all the good stuff underground. So most root crops will require full sun. And one that doesn't is beets. I mean, beets will do best in full sun, but they can also do okay in partial shade. So that's a very quick tip. What I want to jump into next, so we've covered the 3 tips. We have sunlight, we have loose soil, and we have space and time. So 3 things to keep in mind. Again, I always say, no matter really what vegetable we're talking about, if you have any uncertainties about how much space to give your crops when planting or what kind of care to give them, how much water, all that kind of stuff. You can always find that on the seed packet or on the website of the distributor where you got your seeds. So most of the seeds that we have here that I'm using in the education space at Newton Community Farm, we get from Johnny's Seeds. And anytime I have any kind of concern about how to put them in the soil, how to care for them or harvest them or anything like that, I always go online and there's tons of information, very specific information that I'm always able to find. So these are kind of just overarching tips and ideas for taking care of root vegetables, but each variety will have different requirements. So to kind of bolster what we've been talking about, I want to zoom in on two separate root crops today. So we've talked a little bit about both of these, but I'll touch upon beets and carrots because they seem to be two really popular crops for growers to be putting in their gardens. So because they're in the same classification of root vegetables, they do have some overlapping kind of similarities and similar requirements when being cultivated in a garden, but they also have some critical differences. So it's useful to kind of have your eye on those when you're thinking about beets or carrots. So we'll start with beets. Beets are, I wish I had a beet to show as an example, but you can probably picture they're a really beautiful dark purple, or sometimes they're a bright golden orange. If you've ever grown that variety, they're almost like a bold kind of turmeric looking color. And there's also the Chioggia variety, I think is how you say it, which is the really cool striped, like pink and white looking beet. So there's a lot of different varieties of beets, but the most classic are the really deep, rich purple beets. And then if you've ever grown beets or bought beets at a farmer's market, you know that they have nice bushy leaves on top that are also edible and delicious. So beets, they are quick growing crops. So if you, like I mentioned earlier, if you have kind of space in your garden that you don't know what to do with, or you're waiting to plant like a heat-loving crop, even though we're kind of in the heat-loving crop season now with the weather heating up, beets are a really good candidate to put in for a quicker use of garden space. So they won't take up space for too long in comparison with a root crop like potatoes. So like I said, the root and the top are edible, and beets are brassicas, so they are very susceptible to pests. And I've talked about this a bunch. It feels like brassicas are always coming up because they're such a large family of vegetables. So they're related to kale, and they're related to cabbage and all those different brassicas that tend to be really susceptible to pests. So for that reason, beets can be something that are good to cover. So the beets that I have growing here, I have under row cover, which is like a thin kind of, it feels like stockings. It's a really thin material that allows water and sunlight to get through, but doesn't allow bugs to go crazy on your plants. So those can be a good candidate to put under row cover. They can still survive without it if you're not interested in putting that in your garden. It's not always the prettiest. I definitely prefer to look at the growth without having to take off the row cover every day, but it can be really helpful to deter pests. But it's worth keeping in mind because not all root vegetables fall under the brassica category, but it's important to keep in mind when it does, because it's a bummer to get kind of funky beets when you've put so much care into them. So like I said before, beets do best in full sun, but they can also be pretty happy in partial shade. We're definitely, I know when I grow beets, I'm always thinking about the greens on top as well, because I love eating beet greens. I've seen beets grow with either disease or unhealthy leaves on top, and the beets can still grow under the soil, but they tend to be smaller and less delicious and kind of less vibrant. So keeping in mind that those greens are going to want a lot of sunlight, kind of a good argument for keeping them in full sun. But if you have a shaded spot in your garden that you just really want to put some kind of vegetable in, as far as root vegetables go, beets can be a decent candidate for that. So size of your beets will depend on the variety, but it'll also depend on when you harvest them. So beets are typically about 1 inch or 3 inches in diameter. You can get like totally big honkin' beets too, but more often than not, you'll probably be growing smaller beets, and that tends to be better for smaller gardens. An important thing with beets, and this is one of the similarities that beets and carrots have, is that they need to be thinned if they're being direct seeded, and if they're transplanted, which many beets are because they can handle transplant pretty well, they need a little bit of space between them. So if we're thinking about our beets being anywhere from 1 to 3 to 5 inches in diameter, we want to make sure that the roots have a lot of room to grow. And we're keeping in mind that the green growth, the top growth on the top above the soil, can also take up a lot of space. So beet greens can get nice and big. They can kind of fan out like a foot wide. So the beets I have are planted a foot apart. My hope is that all that space will encourage healthy root system growth, but also nice bushy beet green growth as well. If you plant them a little bit closer together, hopefully you'll still get a really healthy root growth beneath the soil, but the hope is that, the expectation with planting them closer together is that the leaves might be a little bit less bushy and abundant, but they'll still be there and they can still be totally healthy. So playing around with how much space you give your beets, there's a little bit of wiggle room with this as a crop, I would say. And like most root vegetables, they like kind of a light, well-draining soil, and they like rock-free soil. So anything that gets in the beet's way can cause it to split or kind of become like oblong instead of circular. So clearing out any rocks or planting beets in a raised bed is a good idea. And if you're going to plant them in a raised bed, they should be about 1 foot deep, the raised bed itself, so that the roots have plenty of space to grow. But I'd say that for beets, a little bit less than a foot you could get away with. But usually with root vegetables, the deeper the better with raised beds. So that brings us to carrots. And I'd say we have enough time to run through carrots kind of catalog. So different from beets, carrots require full sun this is because they need to develop all of their sugars to get that kind of sweet carrot taste that everybody loves in their homegrown carrots. So full sun for these crops. They also like same kind of soil as beets and potatoes and all the rest. They like light, well-draining soil and free of rocks and old roots and anything else that could get in the way. With carrots, if they get funky, it's really no big deal. I've had plenty of delicious carrots that are kind of wonky or shaped funny or forked, like I was talking about. But if you are really looking for those long, plump, delicious carrots, making sure that your bed is as clear of rocks and debris as possible, that's a good first step. Carrots can be put in a raised bed. I haven't done it myself, but apparently if the raised bed is deep enough and if the variety of carrot is not super long, then they can be happy in there. There are varieties of carrots that are kind of closer to baby carrots that are going to be growing a little bit shallower in the soil. So if you're looking to put some in a raised bed, you'd want to keep an eye on what kind of variety you're looking at. And carrots are always direct seeded. So when you're planting your carrots, you want to keep them in a nice straight line and go back when they're about 1 inch or 2 tall to thin them so they have a little bit of space between each other. 1 inch or 1.5 inches is usually sufficient. The reason why you should be thinning before they get to be too much bigger than 2 inches of top growth above the soil is because any bigger than that, means that you're pulling up roots that can kind of disturb the carrots around each other. So if you're thinning and the carrot tops are like 4 or 5 inches, odds are there's a pretty well-developed root underneath the soil, and you'll be pulling that up and kind of disrupting the other carrots, the other roots around that. So trying to thin carrots when they're still small enough that you can pull them out of the soil. If you don't get to do that in time and you are going to thin them when they've grown a little bit more than maybe you expected, which definitely happens with these hot days that we've been getting. We're seeing so much growth in just a really short amount of time. You can always just snip the top of your carrots, and this doesn't guarantee that there won't be a carrot root in the way of the carrots that you want to keep, but it's a kind of a compromise with not pulling up a carrot that would then disrupt the ones around it. And really quickly to touch on harvesting carrots, just since we're on the topic. Harvesting carrots, it's a good idea to loosen the soil before you do so. So you can use something like a pitchfork, and always bearing in mind that we can't see what's beneath the soil, so we're not sure really what we might hit. But with carrots, they tend to grow kind of straight down, whereas potatoes grow out all over the place, and you really don't know what you're going to hit. With carrots, you can kind of have an idea for where they're growing under the soil. So when I've harvested, I usually put a pitchfork in the side of the bed and just kind of loosen it up a little bit, pull the pitchfork out, and then it's easier to yank the carrots out of the soil. Avoiding kind of loosening up by sticking the pitchfork in the middle of the bed is a good idea, so that you don't spear your carrots or ruin your crop or anything like that. And detopping the carrots upon harvest is a good idea as well. If we leave the greens on our carrots, they continue to suck energy and resources from the fruit itself, from the carrot crop itself. So that means that the carrots can end up getting like kind of limp and squishy, or they can become considerably less sweet. So as soon as we harvest our carrots, we chop off the tops, which I've heard are edible, but I know you can make like carrot top pesto, but I don't think that everybody loves eating carrot tops, or there's a common allergen in carrot tops. So make sure you know what you're doing before you eat your carrot tops. And yeah, so that's beets and carrots, and that's a brief overview of growing root vegetables in your garden. We're hoping to put all of these resources on our website soon, but you can always come to our YouTube channel to revisit this video and previous videos. They're all stored on there, as are all of our cooking videos with Jay and our storytime videos with Sue. So there's a lot of resources for the whole family right now on our YouTube page. So feel free to subscribe, and you'll get updates about all of our new videos that are coming out. And as always, thanks for tuning in, and feel free to continue updating us with your garden growth, and we'll see you back here next Wednesday at 1. All right, happy gardening. Bye, everybody.